with a message that will resonate just the same. Today's roundtable will examine some of the more nefarious ways big oil is taking advantage of the American people. Chief among them, the recent allegations of collusion with global oil cartels to raise energy prices for all of us. Energy prices have caused over a third of the inflation we all experienced over the last few years. If these price hikes were intentional, this is a crime, and one that the FTC estimates costs every American hundreds of dollars per year. So let's look a little closer at these allegations. This year, while the Federal Trade Commission was reviewing Exxon's acquisition of Pioneer Natural Resources, the largest oil and gas merger in 20 years, they discovered evidence that Pioneer's CEO, Mr. Scott Sheffield, had been illegally coordinating with OPEC and other oil companies to artificially raise prices for American consumers. With the merger, Mr. Sheffield was slated to join Exxon's board of directors, giving him control over a much larger portion of the oil market and a larger platform to quote-unquote pursue his anti-competitive schemes. The FTC banned him from the board. Unfortunately, however, it turns out that these collusion allegations were not a one-time anomaly. Multiple class action lawsuits brought in the district courts of New Mexico and Nevada now accuse Permian Resources, Chesapeake Energy Corporation, Continental Resources, Diamondback Energy, EOG Resources, Hess Corporation, and Occidental Petroleum, as well as Pioneer, of colluding with OPEC to keep oil prices high. The FTC is now expanding its investigations into more oil companies, looking for smoking gun evidence of criminal collusion to report to the Department of Justice. Yet throughout this entire Congress, Republicans have turned a blind eye, opting to tirelessly blame Biden's quote-unquote war on American energy for energy prices instead. They certainly do not want this roundtable to happen, and neither does Sheffield, who actually hired Trump's former Secretary of Interior's firm to help him kill this roundtable. But here we stand. The FTC complaint and the class action lawsuits provide evidence for a different explanation. Big oil companies conspired to drive up their own profit at the expense of American families by colluding with cartels of adversarial nations like Russia and Iran. These allegations must be taken seriously and thoroughly investigated. The American people deserve to know the truth. Instead, Republicans are working hard to further rig the system for the oil and gas industry. Former President Trump even went as far as to ask 20 oil executives at a closed-door fundraising event for $1 billion in exchange for rolling back oil and gas regulations. And here on Capitol Hill, House Republicans have been busy introducing bills that are a veritable copy and paste of the most egregious pro-polluter proposals in Trump's now infamous Project 2025. In fact, just last week, in the Natural Resources Committee, Republicans held a hearing on a bill that would strip environmental justice and climate change out of the permitting process, and another bill that would drastically limit communities' ability to challenge lawful permits. Two proposals ripped straight from the fossil fuel-friendly pages of Project 2025. To be clear, these proposed handouts to big oil would only add to a very, very long list of giveaways, tax breaks, and subsidies that the fossil fuel industry already receives and manipulates to their liking. Here on the House Natural Resources Committee, we know that better than most. It feels like every week we get a new GAO study or investigative report that uncovers yet another way the fossil fuel industry has taken advantage of or even personally manufactured loopholes or taxpayer-funded freebies into our federal oil and gas leasing system. That's why Natural Resources Democrats have started our own investigation into the big oil collusion allegations, asking the Department of the Interior to examine how the companies we'll talk about today may have used public lands and waters in their price-fixing schemes. We're committed to holding big oil accountable. Once upon a time, we were stuck with fossil fuels as our only option for meeting the country's energy needs. Although those days are gratefully long past us, big oil is pulling out all the stops, from extortion to collusion to trying to keep a hold of its polluting profit-making legacy, and even keeping us from talking the truth. They know all too well what we do too, that there are now cleaner, safer, and more affordable and more sustainable energy options. And big oil is worried. After all, what would happen if we stopped subsidizing corporate pollution, held bad actors accountable, and invested in a more just, equitable, and sustainable energy future? Can we imagine for a moment what this country would look like if we put people over polluters? I look forward to hearing from the panelists about how we can do just that. So now I would like to introduce our panel of experts for their statements. Our first expert is Ms. Alex Witt, Senior Advisor on Oil and Gas with Climate Power. Ms. Witt, please go ahead.
Thank you. Congresswoman Kamala Gurdett and Democratic members of the committee, thank you for having me today. My name is Alex Witt. I'm a Senior Advisor at Climate Power, where I lead our work scrutinizing the predatory practices of oil and gas companies and their political allies. Based on that work, I'm grateful for the opportunity to share some of my observations on how big oil uses its power and influence to raise prices, limit competition, and thwart clean energy progress. For decades, the fossil fuel industry has known about the existence of climate change and, more importantly, that addressing this crisis would hurt their profits. Despite well-documented, multi-decade campaigns of disinformation and deception by big oil, we are now on a path to building an economy that gives Americans real, affordable, clean energy choices. Thanks to the leadership of President Biden, Vice President Harris, and congressional Democrats, the United States enacted the largest climate and clean energy investment in history. We're in a pivotal moment. As American clean energy ascends, the oil industry's stranglehold on American energy is loosening. Since August 2022, there's been a boom in new manufacturing in wind, solar, batteries, electric vehicles, and energy storage projects across the country. Over the last 2 years, Climate Power has tracked more than 330,000 new clean energy jobs. Spanning from Georgia to Michigan to California, we know that these jobs are helping create cleaner, cheaper energy choices for all Americans. Instead of pivoting to the clean energy of the future, oil industry executives are working the system to maximize their shareholder profits at the cost of a livable planet. The Federal Trade Commission is probing executives from major oil firms for pushing up gas prices and coordinating with OPEC and other adversaries to manipulate prices. Earlier this year, the FTC announced that it was launching an investigation into former Pioneer Natural Resources CEO Scott Sheffield. The justification for this investigation was an alleged attempt by Sheffield to collude with OPEC and OPEC Plus to raise oil prices, costing the average household an estimated increase of $500 per car in fuel costs annually. This isn't the first time big oil has been accused of colluding to keep prices high. Executives from Hess, Occidental, and Diamondback Energy have been investigated over their communications with OPEC officials. Additionally, authorities have alleged in more than a dozen lawsuits that Continental Resources, Occidental Petroleum, Hess, Pioneer Natural Resources, and others coordinated to manipulate oil prices. Like these executives, former President Donald Trump recognizes that as Americans get cleaner, cheaper energy alternatives, these companies will be far less dominant and less useful to him. Earlier this year, Trump invited a group of these oil barons to his Mar-a-Lago resort and told them that if they gave $1 billion to his campaign, it would be, quote, a deal. A deal to protect the status quo, line their executives and shareholders' pockets, and stop their competition. And with so much on the line, oil companies have stepped up their political activity. Executives of some of the very companies named in the lawsuits and FTC investigations have ties to former President Trump. Continental Resources billionaire founder Harold Hamm, Occidental Petroleum CEO Vicki Hollub, Brian Sheffield, son of former Pioneer CEO Scott Sheffield, and Hess CEO John Hess, are leaders of the more than $40 million in oil and gas industry donations to Trump and other Republicans this cycle. The industry also spent nearly $72 million on lobbying in the first half of 2024 after spending more than $133 million in 2023. The oil lobby is also spending millions upon millions of dollars in this election in ads attacking those in Congress who don't do their bidding. Of course, their chosen presidential candidate repeats these claims at every opportunity, giving them their money's worth by sowing falsehoods about electric vehicles, regardless of the election outcome. To see what a second Trump administration could look like, we need to look no further than Project 2025, key sections of which were written by oil and gas executives. The manifesto threatens to end clean energy investments. According to a nonpartisan energy innovation report, it would lead to an increase of $240 more in annual energy costs for American households and 1.7 million in total job losses in 2030. In conclusion, Americans continue to benefit from the largest investment in clean energy in our nation's history, from cheaper, more consumer choices and hundreds of thousands of new clean energy jobs. Americans can't afford to follow Trump and this dangerous Project 2025 agenda back in time. We can't continue putting fossil fuel companies and their wealthy executives and shareholders ahead of middle-class families. Thank you. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Witt. Our next expert is Ms. Christina Carlson, Deputy Director of Climate Policy at the Roosevelt Institute. Ms. Carlson, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Vice Ranking Member, Cum Laude Dove, and members of the committee. My name is Christina Carlson. I'm the Deputy Director, as you said, of Climate Policy at the Roosevelt Institute, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to contribute to this timely discussion. My testimony today will focus on the ways that the structure and behaviors of the oil and gas sector creates risk for the macroeconomy without providing commensurate public benefits. The U.S. produces more oil than any other country on Earth, but oil and gas firms, subsidized by taxpayers, are not delivering on their promise of providing stable and cheap domestic energy. In June of 2022, inflation peaked at 9.1%. 1/3 of that came from energy prices, with gasoline prices contributing the lion's share. To add insult to injury, the FTC discovered evidence that the CEO of Pioneer Natural Resources Company, which has since been acquired by ExxonMobil, attempted to collude with OPEC to keep those oil prices high. Pioneer and other big oil firms behaved like many other large corporations during the last several years. They exercised their market power to take advantage of rising inflation by increasing their prices beyond necessary adjustments to account for input costs or supply shortages. But exacerbating these market power effects are three factors specific to the oil and gas sector. First, fossil fuels are ubiquitous. They are underlying inputs to nearly all other sectors of the economy, including transportation, manufacturing, plastics, and retail, in the form of either petrofuels or fossil fuel generated electricity. Consequently, energy price shocks are not limited to the gas pump or home heating bills. Their price effects reverberate throughout the economy. Fossil fuel prices in particular pass through to increased input costs across the board. Second, fossil fuels are volatile. Due to their production dynamics, exposure to geopolitical conflict, and high levels of unpredictable bouts of speculation. Long-term price volatility is also present due to the effects of extreme weather on these firms' operations and strategies, which can compromise supply and distribution. This volatility is actually taken for granted by the Federal Reserve, and energy prices are not even tracked in core CPI measures that the Fed uses to target inflation. The ubiquity and volatility of oil and gas makes our reliance on fossil fuels a significant vulnerability to the macroeconomy. Of the past 12 economic recessions that have taken place in the post-war U.S., 10 were preceded by large oil price increases. Finally, oil and gas firms are heavily subsidized by state and federal governments and have been since the early 1900s, despite recurring calls to end wasteful fossil fuel subsidies. Since its genesis, the domestic oil and gas sector has developed as a public-private partnership, in which state intervention and support provide patient capital for new exploration, research and development support, tax exemptions, and more. But these public supports, intended to secure domestic energy independence, have failed to produce a commensurate level of public benefit. For example, the U.S. is the largest liquefied natural gas exporter in the world, and starting in 2023, the U.S. has been a net exporter of crude oil as well. The profit incentive to sell abroad means that new fossil fuel production does not necessarily contribute to boosting domestic supply or stabilizing prices. Indeed, there are currently no mechanisms in place to require fossil fuel firms to meet domestic demand first. Vulnerable communities directly suffer the health and environmental consequences of a booming export business, while they, along with the rest of U.S. taxpayers, subsidize an inherently destructive industry and struggle to pay their own electricity bills. This cannot continue. we need a publicly managed wind down of fossil fuels. We can start by talking about repealing regulatory loopholes afforded to fossil fuels, repealing federal tax advantages for fossil fuels. We can plan for the next fossil fuel bailout by attaching strings on any federal aid that firms might receive. We can even evaluate mergers and acquisitions for their emissions intensity and environmental regulation compliance. Ultimately, we need a complete and equitable transition to renewable energy sources away from fossil fuels. Over the long term, maintaining energy price stability while retaining a fossil fuel-dependent economy is nearly impossible. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Carlson. Our next expert is Mr. Chris Marshall, Director of the Energy and Environment Program at Accountable US. Mr. Marshall, please go ahead.
Thank you, Vice Ranking Member Kamler-Dove and Democratic members of the committee for the honor to speak with you today. I'm Chris Marshall, Director of the Energy and Environment Program at Accountable.us. Accountable.us is a nonpartisan organization that shines light on corporations and special interests that wield too much unchecked power and influence in Washington and beyond. Our hard-hitting investigations and communications show who is standing in the way of a better future for everyday Americans. The American people are fed up with corporate greed. Americans understand that greedy corporations are spoiling our environment and driving up costs that make it difficult for families to make ends meet. For too long, the federal government system of managing publicly owned oil and gas was broken in favor of the wealthiest energy companies in the world. Some of these companies have demonstrated a willingness to cross ethical and legal lines to profit at the expense of the American public. Before big oil CEOs were caught trying to fix prices with OPEC, they were called out for the unfair advantage they had from the federal government's program that oversees oil and gas drilling on public lands. The Nonpartisan Government Accountability Office has repeatedly rebuked the Department of the Interior and its Bureau of Land Management for failing to provide a fair return for taxpayers when public minerals are developed for private profit. The GAO found that the federal leasing program is vulnerable to waste, fraud, and abuse, while severely undercharging companies to drill, using a royalty rate that was well below what many states charge. Accountable.us's 2023 report shows that ExxonMobil, the same company that tried to add the OPEC colluding CEO to its board, is the largest holder of leases on public lands. Our analysis showed that just a handful of big oil corporations profit the most from a broken system, while locking up sometimes hundreds of thousands of acres of public land just under one company. What's worse is virtually all the leaseholders of public lands have a record of cheating on their royalty obligations and shortchanging taxpayers. They lock up thousands of acres of public land through a Byzantine network of subsidiaries and mergers that make it difficult for anybody to even monitor this activity. None of this happened by accident. It came through years of big oil throwing its political weight around with contributions of politicians, advocacy groups, and think tanks. The clearest and most pressing recent example of this is the Heritage Foundation's controversial and far-right Project 2025, which aims to return us to a rigged system under a future MAGA administration. The oil and gas provisions in Project 2025 were written by a top big oil lobbying group, the Western Energy Alliance. That company counts Exxon and a lot of the other companies we talked about as board members. Incidentally, the Western Energy Alliance has also taken thousands of dollars in political action committee contributions from the same CEO who was caught trying to collude with OPEC to drive up prices for American consumers. Fortunately, the Biden-Harris administration has done a lot of work to ensure that Exxon and other big oil companies finally start paying their fair share. The Inflation Reduction Act and new rules at Interior bring royalty rates in line with what states charge, returning more money to rural counties to provide important services, and new bonding requirements ensure that companies finally pay to clean up the messes they leave behind on our public lands. There's still more work to do. All the same companies that benefited from the old broken system are fighting tooth and nail to bring it back. We can't let the oil and gas industry and their far right-wing mouthpieces return us to the failed policies of the past. We must put people over polluters and profiteering. Thank you for this timely and important roundtable, and for all you do for the American people. And with that, I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Marshall. And last but certainly not least, we have Ms. Becca Iñosa, co-founder of the South Texas Environmental Justice Network. Ms. Iñosa, please go ahead.
Good afternoon. I appreciate the opportunity to speak on the roundtable discussion regarding the issue of oil and gas companies unfairly accessing millions of dollars of subsidies from low-income communities like mine. My name is Becca Iñosa, and my pronouns are she, her. I'm a co-founder of the South Texas Environmental Justice Network, a local organization located in the Rio Grande Valley region of South Texas. I have deep roots in this community, which is on many front lines, including being near the militarized U.S.-Mexico border and on the Gulf Coast, where we experience the impact of climate change through hurricanes and are often targeted for fossil fuel expansion and private space industry activities such as rocket testing. The Rio Grande Valley region is predominantly made up of Latino, Indigenous, and people of color, and we often experience environmental racism. Our community has historically been exploited for cheap labor and has suffered from corporate exploitation, leading to about 25% of families living below the poverty line in the region. Currently, we are facing two proposed methane gas export projects, Rio Grande LNG and Texas LNG, that would receive property tax abatements that exempt them from paying a combined over $300 million in taxes to our already impoverished community of Cameron County. These LNG companies were able to take advantage of these tax abatements due to a flawed process that favors big businesses. Our organization has attempted to communicate with the public officials, the county commissioners, to highlight the detrimental effects of LNG facilities and the injustices of these companies seeking high tax cuts while using taxpayer-funded resources. Unfortunately, many of these officials declined to meet with us, their constituents, while their staff willingly met with representatives from these LNG companies. We have urged for the opportunity to present our research, expert testimonies, and reports during the public hearing regarding these LNG tax abatement applications, but we were denied this opportunity by these officials. On the other hand, the LNG company officials were given almost 2 hours to make corporate sales pitches during these public hearings. Our organization, we also looked at the fine print of these LNG tax abatements. We published a report about the injustices, which showed that the LNG companies threatened existing jobs in the shrimping, ecotourism, and sports fishing industries, which employ hundreds that rely on access to clean waterways, which would be impacted by the company's pollutants. To be clear, these LNG companies would become the largest single source emitter of toxic air pollution and climate-killing emissions in our community, which does not have easy access to healthcare. Conversely, the LNG projects would only provide about 123 permanent jobs to residents living within a 50-mile radius, and essentially the taxpayers, we, would be footing the bill for the salaries of these workers. Our organizations opposed Rio Grande LNG's $10 million donation to a community project fund as part of the tax abatement agreement. It appeared that the company purchased the support of an official, which could result in these elected officials then going on and ignoring an LNG explosion or leak if it were to happen. And we've witnessed these officials do this with Elon Musk's SpaceX in the region. The private space corporation received a tax abatement on claims that they would invest in the community, but ended up causing environmental damage and violating regulations with no response from these same elected officials. The two LNG projects would burden taxpayer-funded infrastructure in our region. Construction of these massive industrial facilities would damage our public roads and require services paid for by taxes. Rio Grande LNG has been clear-cutting the wetlands and pristine lands at their lease site for the last year and has utilized police to patrol the highway for trucks, construction equipment, and highway road blockage, giving away our local tax money to an industry that does not already pay taxes exacerbate the existing problems in our region. This includes crumbling roads, severe drought, poor flooding infrastructure, and low-income community members who were never given the same opportunity for tax breaks. Continuing to provide subsidies or prop up the fossil fuel industry in any way results in communities like mine being sacrificed with the pollution of these LNG facilities and even lower quality of life without funding for basic needs like flooding infrastructure. Subsidies for fossil fuel corporations must end. Fossil fuel corporations must be held accountable for the mess that they have already made. Thank you.
Thank you. Votes have been called, so I'm going to ask my questions, but if some members need to go to do their first vote and then come back, we should have time for everyone's questions. Committee staff will hold up 1 minute remaining reminder to help everyone be aware what time. I will start Thank you all for your expert testimony. It seems that the fossil fuel industry is involved in some very shady behavior, and by that I do not mean planting more green trees. Ms. Iñosa, thank you for traveling all the way from Texas to share your community's experience with the fossil fuel industry. My community is also very familiar with the dangers of living next to fossil fuel development and the unfair burden that it places on them. In your testimony, you lay out what tax breaks for LNG terminals mean for your county's ability to invest in important public services like schools and infrastructure. What are some of the other costs that your community has had to bear because of this fossil fuel development?
Sure. Our community, we need every tax dollar we can get. A regular thunderstorm causes major flooding. We have potholes. If residents manage to pay their energy bills, it's no guarantee that the light will even stay on. We've already experienced these LNG companies damaging roads, causing dust, and exacerbating people's health, people who already have respiratory problems. And these facilities would release dangerous cancer-causing pollutants, volatile organic compounds from their flare stacks and from their ground flares.
So how do inflated energy costs affect your community, and how does that tie into the climate change that you're experiencing?
It is dangerously hot where we live. Community members don't have access to air conditioning, shelters like we should. Families have already died because of how extremely hot it is. We don't have reliable grid infrastructure in Texas, as many people know. During the Texas winter storm, I was in my apartment for almost 3 days without electricity. Many people suffered for much longer. Low-income community members right now are being told that they have to limit their water usage because we're also facing a severe drought. What we need is for low-income community members to be subsidized, to be resourced, to make their homes more sustainable, not be penalized and told to limit large amounts of water when we know, fossil fuel corporations use a tremendous amount of water.
Right. So in our Natural Resources Committee, we are continuing to fight against Republicans stripping away the National Environmental Protection Act's public input procedures. So NEPA, I know, doesn't apply to the LNG tax breaks, but communities should have more, not less, input into the developments and the use of the public tax dollars. So can you please say more about what it would mean for your community if public input from all constituents were better considered rather than just listening to big oil?
Right. If we get a chance to make a public comment, which we don't always get those opportunities, we are given just a limited amount of time to give testimonies to our public officials, and we don't always get a response. We see them making deals behind closed doors in executive session. We're not given, community organizations like mine aren't always given an opportunity to present, and yet we're forced to hear sales pitches, greenwashing tactics, things that are obviously untrue from fossil fuel companies. So we need to be allowed to give public input, we need to be allowed to present, and we need these officials to understand that these are heavily resourced fossil fuel corporations with billions of dollars of access, and that they need to listen to community members who are the experts of our community.
Right, thank you. Thank you so much for that. I will now turn to Representative Huffman, Ranking Member of the Natural Resources Committee's Water, Wildlife, and Fisheries Subcommittee, for any questions that you may have.
Well, thank you, Vice Ranking Member Conlinger-Duff. Thanks for convening this, and to our witnesses. I appreciated everything you all had to say, but the piece I wanted to start with, which I'm especially interested in, is the evidence of collusion that was uncovered by the FTC. Now, clearly, the FTC must have found some concerning things if they decided to ban Mr. Sheffield from joining Exxon's board. So I wonder if you could just take us into the details as specifically as you can, and then also tell us a little bit about the additional information that we really should find a way to consider, and then we can keep working on our Republican friends to join us. You'd think they would care about the oil industry colluding with folks to rig prices and screw American consumers. But apparently, we've still got some work to do there.
Thank you so much, Representative Huffman. The FTC's public complaint noted that Sheffield hadn't just attempted to align with OPEC, but had, quote, private conversations with high-ranking OPEC representatives, assuring them that Pioneer and its Permian Basin rivals were working hard to keep oil output artificially low. The FTC's public complaint includes some heavily redacted sections related to direct contact he had with OPEC representatives, and the FTC also noted that Sheffield was communicating with high-ranking OPEC officials as part of Trump's 2020 deal. Sheffield was coordinating the deal's production cuts for domestic producers, saying, quote, if Texas leads the way, maybe we can get OPEC to cut production. Maybe Saudi and Russia will follow. That was our plan. He added, quote, I was using the tactics of OPEC Plus to get a bigger OPEC Plus done. It's like something out of a television drama, to be perfectly frank.
And why do you think this warrants further investigation?
You know, I would love to see what those redacted sections said, and I would love for Congress to be able to see that.
I would certainly love to know what's in that, too. I mean, just the unredacted pieces of this are quite alarming. So there's every reason to want to see that. I'm just shocked that our Republican colleagues aren't at least curious about what's in those documents. They haven't responded to anything that we've said on this subject. Thank you for your leadership, and let's hope we find a way to get those facts out on the table. Ms. Carlson, I want to ask you about your reference to a publicly managed wind down of fossil fuels. You know, when we first started, I think, understanding the significance and implications of this climate crisis, you know, more than a decade ago, certainly, many of us assumed that the fossil fuel industry would get it and would become clean energy companies, and they would evolve with us to meet this moment and address the crisis. Obviously, they don't want to do that. They have had a pretty good run for the past century with complete impunity over our public lands and our offshore resources and incredible influence over our political system. And I think what they're telling us is no. We do not want to become clean energy companies. We want to continue to use our incredible influence and power to keep things just the way they are. So tell us a little more about, you know, if we could address those problems, what would this publicly managed wind down look like in your view?
Definitely. So a public managed wind down, as we've been calling it, requires a whole of government approach. And we recently released a report from one of our fellows, Kate Aronoff, where she lays out a really extensive policy suite that I'm sure you might want to read later. But I can talk about a few of the elements in there. So one, like I mentioned, we can start by repealing regulatory loopholes. We can talk about repealing federal tax advantages. And something that I think is really important is that the inevitable next fossil fuel bailout that will come across our desk should come with some strings attached, so that we're not just funding these companies after they've misbehaved. Another thing that Kate really emphasizes is that we can talk about forcing these companies to submit what she would call a living will for approval by federal regulators that basically maps out a plan for their bankruptcy and what they plan to do under financial distress to preserve the environment and their own workers. I think this wind down will also require establishing brand new institutions we've never had before. She talks about a transition coordination administration. So that would be like a cabinet level office tasked with triaging relevant federal agencies, funds, research to further this all-of-government approach to the transition, and also an independent public benefit corporation that is wholly or majority owned by the U.S. government. This can act as a clearinghouse for managing physical fossil fuel assets that come under federal control, including orphan wells, for example, and then later be sort of a general purpose energy developer backed by the full faith and credit of the U.S. government. But I'll just add that any costs associated with a proactive, publicly managed wind down of fossil fuels, it pales in comparison to what we've been doing to fund this sector over the past 100 years.
I agree. Thank you very much. I'll yield back.
Thank you, Representative Huffman. I will now turn it over to Representative Porter for any questions that you may have.
Thank you. When my kids make a mess, which happens,
Really?
they have to clean it up. And they don't get to hide in their rooms or wait till I come and clean it up for them. So if my kids understand this, it's pretty clear to me that big oil companies understand the general principle here. And they're smart enough to know. My colleagues have demonstrated how they are manipulating the global oil market for their benefit, driving up costs for Americans, and lining their pockets, all while receiving billions in subsidies and paying little to no federal tax. I think for me, on a bipartisan basis, like this is the most egregious part, how Republicans continue to give them handouts and then claim somehow to be the party of fiscal responsibility. So I want to take a look at how big oil companies manage to avoid cleaning up their messes. Oil and gas companies lease waters in the Gulf of Mexico from the federal government to drill and to extract. When they are no longer using the infrastructure, these companies are required by law to decommission it. By plugging the wells, removing the platforms. Seems simple enough. When you're done, clean up. Mr. Marshall, what happens when companies don't decommission their infrastructure on time?
Thank you for the question, Representative Porter. When companies fail to decommission and plug their offshore wells, they deteriorate and become vulnerable to failure. They spill oil and other chemicals. They threaten economies and vital ecosystems. And it's taxpayers who end up footing the bill for cleanup.
So right now, my understanding is 75% of idle or end of lease oil wells and platforms in the Gulf of Mexico are past the deadline to be decommissioned, which means oil and gas companies are not following the law. The government, and here's the really troubling thing, the government only holds enough in bonds, that is monetary promises, from oil and gas companies to cover an estimated 9% of the offshore decommissioning costs. That means we could be on the hook for, just doing the math, 91% of cleaning up these companies' messes. Mr. Marshall, are these companies not paying for cleanup costs because they can't afford it?
Either they're not paying for cleanup costs because they don't have to. They can run down the clock. That's why reforms like your Plug Offshore Wells Act are so important. And I'd add bonding reforms in the BLM onshore leasing rule are extraordinarily helpful reform that will keep companies responsible for paying and cleaning up the messes that they leave behind in the Gulf of Mexico and on our onshore public.
Absolutely. I mean, look, the 6 largest oil companies, U.S. oil companies, in 2022 made $219 billion in profit. That's not revenue. That's profit. Money they have available. And they paid out a record $110 billion to their investors. So they chose to pay out to their shareholders instead of using the money as required by law for responsible and timely cleanup. In fact, many big oil companies transfer assets to smaller companies with fewer resources, who then transfer them to even smaller companies, and then ultimately that basically shell company files bankruptcy to avoid paying for the damage that big oil, who got all the profits from extracting from the well, got. I was a bankruptcy law professor. I've seen this road show. Right now, these companies are suing to block the Biden administration proposal that would require them to cover their damages. So if they don't clean it up, what happens? Who has to pay?
I mean, it's the taxpayers who get footed with the bill, and the bill's higher than it would be if they were cleaned up promptly. Because the mess is higher.
Do some taxpayers not have to pay? Like, is there anybody here which taxpayer benefits from this?
I mean, the taxpayers who benefit are the shareholders of these big companies.
So unless you're getting mega bucks in your shares held in Enron or any other company, Shell, pick your company, you're paying to clean up their messes. You're literally, think about the parent, we've all been there, who has to bend over and pick up the Legos, and you step on those things and they do not feel good. Because they don't. We wouldn't parent like this. Why would we govern like this? And I think that's the question we need to be putting to Republicans. I just want to close with one observation. No Republicans have co-sponsored my bill to hold big oil accountable and to make them clean up their own messes. None. I yield back.
Thank you, Professor Porter. I will now turn to Representative Stansberry, ranking member of the Natural Resource Committee's Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee, for any questions that you may have.
All right, well, thank you, Vice Ranking Member. I'm Melanie Stansberry, and I'm deeply proud, honored, and humbled to represent New Mexico's 1st Congressional District. And New Mexico is ground zero for the oil and gas boom, and so I'm going to take a moment to talk about that here in a second. But I want to just observe our surroundings. For those of you who are joining us remotely, we are in a dark basement room underneath the Capitol because the Republicans denied us access to use a hearing room to hold this roundtable. Now, I've been involved in a lot of roundtables, and we don't usually get denied from using public spaces inside the Capitol, but for some reason, they didn't want us in a public space that was accessible to the actual public to hear about price fixing by oil and gas companies that's directly affecting the American people. Now, I want to note that in the subcommittee that I'm the ranking member for, we held a oversight hearing just a few weeks ago about a just transition, and they did the exact same thing to us. And eventually, because we got creative, they let us use a hearing room of another committee, but they wouldn't let us use the AV equipment so it could actually be transmitted over the web. So my question for the Republicans is, what are you hiding? Why do you not want the American people to actually hear about what oil and gas companies are doing? Listen, we all use oil and gas. It is a part of our economy right now. But what we know is that many of these large companies are engaged in actual illegal activity. And not only is it illegal, it would threaten their future business if the American people knew what was going on. In fact, if they knew, if there was actual accountability for some of the price fixing activities that is being investigated as part of this hearing right now, we know that some of these companies would actually lose leases because it's prohibited by federal rules and regulations. I think it's also noteworthy that one of the companies that is accused of price fixing and colluding actually attended Donald Trump's Mar-a-Lago meeting on energy, in which he asked for $1 billion in campaign contributions. So my question is, what exactly do Republicans have up their sleeve? And, my colleagues have already mentioned Project 2025. And for those who've not read this document, it is filled with policies that the Trump administration plans to bring back and to try to advance in the next administration. In fact, you can read, there's dozens and dozens of pages where they talk about opening oil and gas leases, both onshore, offshore. They talk about revoking all of the executive orders on clean energy. They talk about taking us out of international agreements on climate change. And they have a whole slew of other policies, which can easily be summed up in Donald Trump's drill, baby, drill, which he said on national television in his last debate. So, it's a perplexing matter for me as a New Mexican because we are seeing record drilling and record profits happening on the ground. In fact, our Republican colleagues are constantly talking about how we need to be energy secure. People need to understand we are energy secure. We have never had this high of oil and gas production in the United States in American history, and we are actually domestically energy secure. And not only are we secure in the oil and gas sector, we just passed 2 years ago, because of this side of the aisle, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the largest single investment in climate and clean energy, not only in American history, but in the history of any country on planet Earth. So we're in actually pretty good shape for a big energy transition. So what are the Republicans trying to hide from the American people? Why don't they want us to be talking about these issues? Why is their first bill, H.R. 1, that they introduced this Congress about jacking up oil and gas profits? Well, follow the money, right? Mm-hmm. It's all about profits. So, we've heard from our witnesses here today about some of the issues involved here. But Ms. Carlson, I want to say thank you for talking about just transition. This is an issue that's very important to me. My parents were actually energy workers who experienced the boom and bust cycle. In fact, my mother worked as a machine operator at a power plant that was just decommissioned in New Mexico. My dad was a welder for Halliburton Oil back in the day. And they lost their jobs when there was a bust in the oil and boom cycle in New Mexico. And so for me, energy transition is a very personal issue. It's about people in our communities. also in the Rio Grande Valley, but north of you guys. And so my question, I think, for both Ms. Iñosa and for Ms. Carlson is, talk to us about the importance of a just transition for our communities and why we need to be talking about this.
Sure. I'll let you do this.
We need community-led solutions where the community has input. That's been the problem since the beginning, is that the only ones with the loud voices that are getting listened to is fossil fuel corporations. We actually need the original native people of our region, the Carrizo-Comocrudo tribe of Texas, to be consulted with. Their voices aren't being heard. And we need, reliable infrastructure. We need solar energy, wind energy that is not exploitative.
Absolutely.
I'd add that I think a transition away from fossil fuels is inevitable, and the question is if it's going to be managed and just or not. If the corporations lead that transition, it won't happen fast enough to prevent the worst of climate catastrophe. And two, they're going to do everything in their power to shift their losses onto workers, onto communities that depend on their revenues and the planet. This is already happening. We can take the coal industry and as an indication of what's to come. In our latest report, we talk about how between 2012 and 2017, 4 of the United States' largest coal producers used bankruptcy to shed $5.2 billion of environmental and retiree liabilities, essentially transferring them onto public balance sheets. And for states that rely heavily on fossil fuel revenues, this impact can be huge. In New Mexico, fossil fuel revenues account for 14% of state and locally generated public revenues. In Wyoming, that's 54%. In North Dakota, it's 29%. In Alaska, it's 20%. So this transition is ongoing. The government needs to be in the driver's seat to make sure that we're protecting communities along the way.
Thank you very much. And I know I'm out of time for my contribution here, but I'll say, to add on, I believe that our communities need to be not only at the table, but driving this effort, because at the end of the day, these are the people that are going to be there for generations to come. And finally, I just want to say this. We're talking about collusion, we're talking about illegal activity, we're talking about illicit campaign donations and dark rooms in Mar-a-Lago, but these oil companies are stealing money from the American people. Through collusion, $500 a year in additional costs are being put on each family for every car in America because they're price fixing right now. That means they're stealing American people's money to make themselves richer, and that is not okay. So I really want to say thank you, Vice Ranking Member, soon to be Chair, for holding this important hearing, because we got to hold these people accountable.
Well, thank you, Pastor Stansberry, for that. And I would now like to invite Representative Magaziner for any questions that he may have.
Well, thank you so much to the Vice Ranking Member and my colleagues and all of you. I am very excited that we are having this roundtable, and it, of course, is no surprise that our Republican colleagues are trying to silence us by sending us to the basement, but they will not be successful, because the American people are struggling with high costs, struggling with inflation, and the big oil and gas companies are overcharging Americans for gas, for heating oil, and for other essentials. Last year, the big oil and gas companies made $172 billion of profits. Profits. That's not money they use to pay their workers or to fund more drilling. That is $172 billion of profits that they kept for themselves while working people were being overcharged. That's $517 from each American citizen last year alone. So the next time all of us look at our bank accounts, think about that $517 that would be there if it were not for the big oil company profits. I have 2 kids, so my wife and I and our kids were a family of 4. If you're a family of 4 like us, that's more than $2,000 out of a family of 4's pockets last year that went directly into the profits of the big oil and gas companies. And yes, companies in our country are entitled to make a profit, but they shouldn't be able to make any profit. Over the last 3 years, Exxon has had more than a 10% profit margin. How does that compare to other big companies from other industries? Amazon's net profit margin over the same period was just 4%. Walmart's was barely 2%. And Exxon's profit margin was 10%. So something is happening here with the oil and gas industry that is just not right. So let's dig into this a little bit more. And I want to thank our panelists again for coming. Let me ask Ms. Witt, can you explain how it is possible for profit margins to be so high in the oil and gas industry when this is supposedly a competitive industry?
Well, thank you so much for that question, Representative Magaziner. And I think that, I would need to get back to you with specific details on that question. But I think at the end of the day, what we're looking at is companies that have been brazen in their announcements that they are looking to maximize shareholder profits. So they will continue to double down on dirty fossil fuels instead of supporting transitions to a clean energy economy. I think instead of investing in the kind of technology that would allow us to move toward energy that is both sustaining our economy, creating jobs, they are preferring to stick to what they know in a sense, and to invest in their wealthy donors or their wealthy investors.
Thank you. And I'll ask you, I'll open this up to anyone on the panel. So Pioneer, the company that the FTC alleges was colluding with OPEC to raise prices, was recently sold to ExxonMobil. Generally speaking, does industry consolidation in the oil and gas industry or in any industry raise prices or lower prices for consumers? Anyone want to take a stab at that?
Raise them.
Yes, obviously. So in addition to the collusion, we have industry consolidation that further puts upward pressure on prices. So can you comment, are there things that Congress can do to ensure stronger enforcement of antitrust laws in the oil and gas industry, things that can help make sure that we have real competition to help lower prices?
I think, there's a lot that can be done here. More enforcement from the FTC, like what we saw with Mr. Sheffield. That's a great start. Passing Senator Klobuchar's Competition and Antitrust Law Enforcement Reform Act would also go a long way toward addressing a lot of the problems by giving federal enforcers the resources they need while improving the rules and anti-competitive conduct that we're doing.
The last thing I'll say, since my time is up, is there's also a bill that I'm a co-sponsor of, the Big Oil Windfall Profits Tax Act, which would require big oil and gas companies to return a portion of their profits back to consumers in the form of rebates if prices get too high. So I'll be encouraging my colleagues to look at that as well. But I want to thank you all for your work and your advocacy and your excellent presentations today.
Thank you for that, Representative Magaziner, and thank you all for attending this Democratic Roundtable on holding big oil accountable for extortion, collusion, and pollution. We are reporting live from the basement of the Capitol, but today we are listening to the people and not the polluters. So thank you so much for attending.